co-director of the Center for Poverty and Inequality Research, and I'm really excited to see all of you today and to introduce our speaker in just a few minutes. I just want to make a couple of announcements. This is our first event of the quarter, and we have a lot going on this quarter and a lot we're planning for winter and spring as well. But next week, actually, we have two different events. We are co-sponsoring an event with the Scholar Strategy Network on Thursday from 12 to 1:30. The title is Connecting and Building Relationships with Policymakers and Civic Organizations. It's kind of more of a workshop. So if you're interested in disseminating your research and learning how to make it a more effective communications with policymakers, I really encourage you to participate. And then we also have our second seminar for the quarter next Friday at 3 o'clock. And that's going to be Drew Hoffman from the Sociology Department. And the title of his talk is Presidential Framing of Health Inequality from FDR to Trump. And so it's going to be sort of a combination of, well, it's going to be a framing with a sort of political science perspective of how the United States has addressed health inequalities over the years. So without further ado, I would like to, oh, actually I should, before I introduce Guy, let me also just say that we're gonna sort of do this the way we did Zoom seminars last year, where for the most part, the speaker is gonna hold the stage for until his talk is done. And then while you have ideas or comments or questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And Jacob, my co-director, has very kindly offered to run the Q&A afterwards. And so he'll use that as sort of a starting point for the ensuing discussion. So that is how we're gonna run things today. And without more announcements, let me go ahead and introduce Guy Feldman, who's on the faculty at the School of Social Work at Tel Aviv University. Guy's research focuses on the problem of poverty and how it's managed in the face of a changing economic, political, and cultural environment. His early work examined asset building strategies that aim to help low-income families, especially non-white single mothers, save and accumulate assets for long-term financial security. And his research emphasizes the depoliticization of poverty and shows that asset building is a powerful device for achieving consent or acquiescence to deep structural injustice and persistent inequality. And right now he's working on a book manuscript that he has under contract with the University of California Press, which is on this general topic. Today, his talk is going to focus on housing insecurity, and we are super happy to have him here. And without further ado, I think I'm just going to pass it over to you, Guy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Marianne, and hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my, sorry, just a second. My slides. Hold on just a second. Sorry about that. Okay. Right. All right. I hope that everyone can see. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. It was really a pleasure and an honor to be here and to speak at this great center. As Marianne said, my name is Guy Feldman, and I'm faculty member at Tel Aviv University, School of Social Work in Israel. I was born in Israel, born and raised, trained as a social worker, and then worked as a community organizer in Israel for several years. I moved to the US about a decade ago to pursue a PhD in social work, but returned to Israel about 4.5 years ago and started working at Tel Aviv University. So I think I know both countries pretty decently, especially in terms of issues of poverty and social welfare policy. In my talk today, I will present a study investigating the question of how differently positioned um, families confront housing insecurity in the private rental market in Israel. And in many respects, this study, as Marianne, when she introduced me, said, this study really reflects a larger question which motivates my scholarship concerning how our society deals with the problem of poverty today and how poor subjects are governed and controlled. Based on in-depth interviews with low-income families who live across Israel and struggle to afford housing, I will present findings that generate new insights into the links between poverty and housing in the 21st century. And I'm hoping that we can draw on these findings together to offer a few lessons for housing insecurity and housing policy in the US. Okay. So I want to start with just a little bit of background on housing insecurity. Housing has historically been central to the lives of poor communities and families. For several decades, however, scholars of poverty had not really appreciated how housing dynamics shape the life circumstances of poor families. In recent years, many countries around the world, US, Israel, and many other countries have experienced an acute housing crisis that placed a significant burden on poor families and communities. In the private rental market, where many poor families find housing, rent costs have soared, and poor families have been compelled to spend a large share of their income on rent and other housing costs. I want to, just share with you some numbers. In 14 OECD countries, for example, more than 2 out of 5 low-income households in the private rental market spent over 40% of their income on housing in 2017. In the US, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities recently found that 4 in 10 low-income citizens pay more than half of their rent. 40% of low-income citizens in the US pay more than half of their rent. In California, the numbers are even worse. 56% of low-income rental households in the state, that is almost 6 in 10 families, most of them, by the way, are families of color, pay more than half of their income on rent. If inflation-adjusted median household rents increased in California by 16% from 2006 to 2017, but median hourly wages for workers declined in California by 0.5% between 2006 and 2017. And these high housing costs are one of the main reasons why California, for example, has the highest poverty rates of the 50 states, according to some measures of poverty. In the process, low-income families in the US, as well as in other countries, receive no or very minimal housing assistance from the government and are basically left to fend for themselves in the housing market. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, for instance, 3 in 4 low-income renters who need rental assistance today in the US do not receive it due to limited funding. In response to these developments, researchers of poverty have begun to explore the prevalence, sources, and consequences of the phenomenon of housing insecurity among families and communities living in poverty. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, housing insecurity is, and I quote, an umbrella term that encompasses several dimensions of housing problems people may experience, including affordability, safety, quality, insecurity, and loss of housing. End of quote. One strand of the literature on housing insecurity has examined the political economy of housing insecurity and the housing crisis in countries around the world. Raquel Rolnick, for example, offers a macro-level analysis of the ways in which financialization processes have penetrated into cities around the world, generating homelessness and dispossession. Another group of studies has traced how poor families lose their home through eviction, the act of removing tenants from property. In his foundational and groundbreaking work, Desmond demonstrates how evictions have become commonplace for some poor families in the US. The reality of eviction, Desmond shows, harms these families in significant ways. For example, it leads to job loss and constitutes a traumatic experience for them. A third group of studies has placed homelessness at the center of their analysis of housing insecurity, including studies that examine the experiences of homeless people living on the streets and in shelters. And of course, another strand of the literature on housing insecurity has evaluated the effects of housing assistance policies, for example, public housing and housing vouchers, on various outcomes for marginalized families and communities. To be sure, scholars have provided a rich portrait of housing insecurity as an urgent social and political problem, excuse me, affecting many poor families. Yet, despite its many important insights, I have identified a few important gaps in this literature. One significant gap is that little attention has been given to the perspective of poor subjects, that is, how people on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder experience housing insecurity, especially as they navigate the private rental market where many of them live. As noted, Desmond studied the experience of renting families who were about to lose their homes in the US. And there is also literature on the lived experience of homelessness. However, these studies have drawn specialist attention to the extreme cases of housing insecurity, that is, eviction and homelessness, while devoting less attention to how low income families navigate other forms of housing insecurity prevalent in the private housing market today. My study, the study that I'm going to present to you in a minute, contributes to the literature on housing insecurity by investigating and theorizing poor families' everyday struggle to pay for housing in the private rental market. I argue that scholars and citizens will misunderstand housing insecurity in the context of impoverishment today if they fail to give attention to these lived experience and struggles for survival. So I want to say just a few words about the theoretical approach that inspires me in this research. Theoretically, the study, excuse me, theoretically, the study employs a relational approach to poverty, which points to the centrality of socioeconomic relationships to understanding the problem of poverty. Relational poverty analysis does not view poverty as a category that people are assigned to or a condition that they endure. Instead, it focuses on the complex web of economic, political, and cultural relationships that produce poverty and make it persist across class, race, ethnicity, and gender lines. At the same time, relational analysis explores different kinds of anti-poverty politics that emerge in response to these relationships. Given that poverty is better understood as a relationship, relational poverty theory focuses not only on impoverished families, but also on social workers, nonprofit organizations, policymakers, and other powerful actors. In line with this theoretical approach, my study conceptualizes housing insecurity as a relational process that produces particular kinds of identities and experiences among poor actors. Therefore, among other things, the study explores how the relations between the poor and non-poor shape the struggle of the formal group for affordable housing. So before I start and telling you about the findings, as I noted earlier, my study focuses on housing insecurity in Israel, which offers, I think, an interesting and informative case study. Despite the egalitarian ethos attached to its origins, Israel has evolved into a highly unequal market-centered society. Today, it has one of the highest rates of poverty among developed countries. 18% of families lived below the poverty line in 2018 in Israel. Like many other countries around the world, Israel has experienced a significant housing crisis over the past 2 decades or so, with far reaching consequences for families and communities in poverty. The highest rates of renters in Israel, not surprisingly, are among low income families. 41% of households in the lowest decile and 33% of households in the second decile rented a house in Israel in 2017. Furthermore, evidence show that housing costs among renters as a relative proportion of their income increase as the income of the household decreases. In 2016, all renting families from the bottom half of the income distribution in Israel spent over 30% of their income on rent and other housing costs. All renting families from the bottom half of the income distribution spent over 30% of their income on rent in Israel. Renting households in the lowest decile, for example, spent 62% of their income on rent. In response to these trends, the welfare state in Israel provides only limited housing assistance to poor families, mainly in the form of public housing and rental assistance. Public housing in Israel is in dismal condition as the number of public housing units has decreased dramatically and consistently over the past few years. In 2020, there were only 53,000 public housing units compared to 108,000 in 1998. As a result, the wait period for public housing in Israel is often several years long, compelling many eligible families to rent a house in the private housing market. Alongside public housing, the Israeli welfare state also provides rental assistance in the form of direct cash payments to eligible impoverished families who rent an apartment in the private rental market. Although both the budget for rental assistance and the number of eligible poor families have increased in recent years, the average monthly rent subsidy that each family receives, approximately $270, is still too small and does not reflect the high cost of housing in Israel. Therefore, the lack of housing stability is among the most pressing issues facing underprivileged families in Israel. In terms of method, the current study draws on a constructivist perspective and utilizes qualitative methods. I'm a qualitative researcher and I do qualitative studies on poverty. And this current study also utilizes qualitative methods. I think that the constructivist perspective views reality as a process of active construction in which people make sense of the world around them. The constructivist view in qualitative research in particular seeks to understand the social phenomenon through a close examination of people's individual perceptions and experiences. In light of the broader socio-political environment. I therefore think that this perspective is most appropriate to pursue the goals of this study. The sample includes 100 families. I recruited participants who were married or single parents of at least one child, and of course, participants who rent a home and are not homeowners. I sought to achieve diversity in terms of immigration status, nationality, and religion. The sample therefore included participants from 4 subgroups: 3 Jewish, non-Orthodox native-born immigrants and ultra-Orthodox, and 1 Arab. And these subgroups were chosen because they are consistent with the breakdown of households that appears in the annual Poverty and Social Gaps report published by the National Insurance Institute of Israel. In-depth interviews were the primary method of data collection in the study. According to Lamont and Swidler, 2 prominent qualitative researchers in the US, in-depth interviews combine, quote, depth of understanding with purposeful, systematic, analytic research design to answer theoretical motivated questions, end of quote. These interviews are therefore congruent with the study's aim to understand how families living in poverty experience the phenomenon of housing insecurity. Over the past year and a half, my team and I have collected a lot of evidence, and we have recently started to analyze it. Due to time limitation, I'll focus on two major themes that emerge from the evidence so far: the meaning of housing, and for families, of course, and their coping strategy. So I want to start with the meaning of housing. One of the recurring themes in the study refers to the meaning participants attribute to housing. Participants' construction of housing makes a clear distinction between ownership of housing and rental housing. They benevolently represented ownership of housing as offering security, stability, and calm. In contrast, rental housing, especially the homes where they had lived over the years, was seen as exposing them to vulnerability, domination, and stress. Many participants construe homeownership as central to their life, something that serves as an anchor for prosperity and progress. Sandy, for example, is a single mother to 8-year-old twins who works part-time in a private medical services company. She equates home ownership with security and finding one's place in the world. She explained, and I quote, "I would like to have my own home because I'm constantly afraid that something bad would happen to me and my daughters would end up without their own little corner in the world. That's my biggest fear. Let's say that I would own my own place. Then I'd be calm, knowing that no one can throw them out of their home." On the other end of quote. On the other hand, participants from all four groups portray rental housing, their existing and past homes in particular, as an oppressive arena that subjugates them to the interests of more powerful people and generates a lot of pressure. They feel alienated from these homes, equating them with a general sense of precarity and injustice. Aaron, for example, is an ultra-Orthodox young man, married and the father of one boy. He rents a house in a high-poverty religious neighborhood, a house that he completely renovated on his own with some financial help from the landlord. Aaron illustrates the view of rental housing as a place that breeds instability. I quote, "My wife told me recently, I want to move on. I want to have a roof over my head. Let's say after 3 years, all of a sudden, things don't work out. And then the landlord comes and asks you to take all your stuff and leave. So it's always something that is not yours. You invest in something that is not yours. You invest in something that eventually is temporary and unstable." End of quote. Other participants see rental housing as an arena that breeds emotional distress. Ines, for example, immigrated from Argentina with her 12-year-old twins. She came to Israel with her boys 7 years ago, while the rest of her family stayed in Argentina. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in a small agricultural community. Throughout the interview, she described how the rental market creates and sustains her vulnerabilities, and hence is a domain of daily emotional pain. This next quote is taken from different parts in the interview with her. "A year after we moved to Israel, I started taking sleeping pills regularly because I wasn't able to sleep well. Even with a sleeping pill, I sleep only 4 hours and then wake up. I have all kinds of worries. A week from now, I have to pay the rent, and I only have 1,000 shekels, which is about $350. It's difficult. I sometimes close the door in my room and cry alone because I don't want my children to see." End of quote. In sum, for most participants in the study, ownership of housing means order and stability. It is a crucial component of their psychological well-being and the main way in which they can care for their children. It is represented against the ominous shadow of rental housing, which is seen as the source of chaos and uncertainty. My findings also suggest that to cope with the problem of housing insecurity in their daily lives, participants employed 3 distinct coping strategies at the household level. making compromises on housing quality, engaging in negotiations with the landlord, and overdrawing the bank account and practicing thriftiness. Taking together, these coping practices enable the families to somehow survive on the limited options the housing market and economy offer them. Most participants in the study described the various compromises they made on housing quality and attributes so they could give their families a roof over their head. One of the most common compromises is renting a small dwelling that does not fit the size of the family, as well as each member's needs. Sandy, for example, who we met earlier, had lived for 4 years with her two daughters in a one-bedroom apartment that was, according to her, and I quote, old and rotten. Her daughters stayed in the bedroom, and the living room served as her room. She described, and I quote, each time my daughter's friends would come visit, they would ask me, you don't have a living room? It really bothered me. I didn't want my daughters to be labeled as poor. You know, kids can be mean. So it was really important for me to move to a two-bedroom apartment. Also for me, I couldn't host anyone there, not even invite a friend to come sit with me because there's no room. I didn't even have a place to sit in the kitchen. So the whole 4 years we lived there, no one came to visit us. It really bothered me and my daughters. I need company. I need people my age to talk to. Always going to my friend's house without inviting them over, that didn't make me feel good. End of quote. Fortunately, a month before the interview, Sandy moved to a two-bedroom apartment that is owned by one of her relatives, who gave her a fairly good deal on renting the place. While it is cheaper than similar dwellings in the market, Sandy still spends more than half of her income on rent. Alongside the compromise on the size of the dwelling, participants also describe making compromises concerning the physical condition of the home they rent. The families in the study, findings show, sometimes pay the price for making this compromise. For example, Gal is a single mother of a 6-year-old daughter. She lives in a small apartment in a city located on the suburbs of Tel Aviv. In the interview, Gal described the dire condition of her apartment, explaining that it's the main reason why the rent is lower compared to other apartments in the neighborhood. However, the apartment's poor condition once caused a dangerous problem to Gal and her daughter. This is a quote from the interview. This is an old house, okay? But I pay only 4,000 shekels, approximately $1,300. The electrical system is old and it broke recently, and one of the lamps started burning. Luckily, I smelled something burning, and my daughter was telling me, Mom, something is burning. What's burning? So I ran into the room and I see the lamp on fire, just melting. I fixed the lamp at my own expense. Another coping strategy common among the families we interviewed was engaging in negotiations with the landlord over payments of monthly rent. First, it is important to note that my findings show that almost all participants told us that paying the rent on time each month is their top priority before anything else. For example, before paying water or electricity bill. Samer, for example, is an Arab single mother for 4 children. She divorced her partner after being married to him for 13 years because he had been physically violent with her. She lives with her 4 kids in a 3-bedroom apartment. Samer illustrated how she gives priority to paying the rent every month. And I quote, I do the impossible to pay the rent. I don't own the house. Other people own it, and they don't have patience. On the rent due date, I have to pay it, and that's it. And then the interviewer asks her, and what do you do if you don't have enough money? So Samuel responds, if I have a bracelet or necklace, I sell it. I'll sell myself and won't let my kids feel humiliated. I won't let someone come to the house and scream at me. End of quote. Despite the vital centrality of paying rent on time for the families in the study, Many of them told us that there were times in which they were not able to pay rent by the due date. In these cases, participants described how they negotiated with their landlord on their rent, asking him or her for a few more days so they could come up with the entire amount, or negotiating a rent reduction on certain months. Participants told us in the interview that landlords often agreed to make some concessions. Yossi, for example, is married and has three small children. He lives with his family in a two-bedroom apartment in a major city in central Israel. He noted in the interview, the rent due date on our lease is on the 11th, but there are instances in which I don't have the money, so I pay him on the 17th or the 20th or on the 25th of the month, whenever I'm able to arrange the money. I told you there were periods in which I really struggled, searching everywhere how to get the money. The landlord wasn't angry at me, he understood. Interestingly, when Yossi negotiates a payment delay, he does not tell his landlord that it is due to the family's financial hardship, as he feels deeply ashamed for this. He explains, and I quote, the landlord once asked me why I didn't pay the rent, so I told him there was an error in my bank's website. I didn't feel comfortable telling him I didn't have money to pay him. End of quote. Similarly, Yafit is a single mother of three children who lives in a two-bedroom apartment. Her three children sleep in one small bedroom while she stays in the other bedroom. Her economic situation has been dire for several years, leading her to share in the interview that there were many times in the past in which she was not able to pay the rent on time. On one occasion, Yafit used the COVID-19 pandemic to negotiate a rent reduction. She said in the interview, and I quote, I told the landlord, be more considerate. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. Reduce the monthly rent. So on two occasions, he agreed and reduced around 500 shekels, which is approximately $150. End of quote. Through this interaction around the rent, Yafit's landlord learned about the links between poverty, housing, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, participants in the study described how overdrawing their bank account has been another strategy they use to ensure their families have a roof over their heads and that they are not in danger of being evicted. To complement this, the study also found that participants practice thriftiness. Though their cash resources are limited in the first place and make it difficult to provide basic needs, participants describe how they nonetheless find ways to spend less on things so they could have more money left to pay their rent. In short, overdrawing the bank account and thriftiness are another common strategy low income families use to confront housing insecurity. Ella, for example, told us how she overdraws her bank account to make the payment to her landlord, but it was also important for her to know that going overdrawn does not bother her that much. This is a quote from the interview with Ella. I sometimes overdraw my bank account by 20,000 shekels, which is about $6,000. Some months even more than that. I prefer to owe the bank and not to people. That's my biggest fear, to owe someone. I don't mind owning the bank. They can chase me. I don't care about them. Let them not sleep at night. But I always pay so to everyone, so I sleep great. End of quote. Similarly, Ines, whom we met earlier, also goes overdrawn when she runs out of money, but still needs to pay the rent. Yet, in contrast to Ella, Ines also acknowledged the emotional toll this strategy takes. This is a quote. You go to the bank and you take out more and more money, and then you start sipping deeper and deeper into your overdraft, and you're scared that the bank will call you and you don't sleep at night. End of quote. As I noted earlier, alongside overdrawing their account, families in the study also practice thriftiness. That is, they carefully and wisely manage their finances and reduce their spending as much as possible, hoping that this strategy would enable them to have enough money to pay the rent each month. For example, Ines described how despite the fact that Israel is very hot and humid during the summer, she does not use the air conditioner to lower her electricity expenses. She said, quote, "In the summer it's very hot, but I have to tell my kids not to turn on the air conditioner because it would lead to a big spike in the electricity bill. So you have to be stingy all the time." End of quote. Other participants acknowledged that they buy things for their home only after they are not able to get them in used condition or for free. Margalit, for instance, is a single mother of 2 children. She expressed in the interview her preference for used items instead of new. This is a quote. "I used to be ashamed to take used stuff. Back then I said, how can you take something that was used by someone else? But today, if someone gives or donates, I'll take it. Why not? I'm not ashamed anymore, and the fact that it's used doesn't bother me. I try hard to save." Vera, end of quote. Vera, who is married and has a 1-year-old baby, succinctly summarizes the family's thriftiness. Quote, "I calculate our income and expenses. I run a bad budget and I have everything written down and I know exactly where the money goes." So, as I said, the study has focused on how low income families confront housing insecurity in the private rental market. Some of the findings I presented corroborate previous studies on the lived experience of poverty in the US, which show that low income families overdraw their accounts and are frugal when it comes to their finances. However, making compromises on housing quality and engaging in negotiations with their landlord are distinct coping strategies that families employ and that previous studies of poverty have not documented. Now, the US rental housing market is different from the Israeli market. Among other things, rental housing in the US is owned primarily by a diverse group of private for-profit companies, while in Israel it is owned mostly by middle and upper class families. I think it is therefore interesting to examine whether the strategy of negotiating rent payments is also common among low-income families in the US. My findings diverge from earlier studies in other ways as well. Past studies found that low-income mothers in the US give priority to dwelling attributes, for example, size, in their decision which home to rent. Contrary to these previous findings, my findings suggest that low-income families are forced to sacrifice the attributes and quality of the homes they rent so they could barely afford market rent. Theoretically, I argue, among other things, that the interactions and negotiations with the landlords have the potential to operate as what Victoria Lawson and Sarah Elwood call contact zones, which are, and I quote, "mutable sites or moments of interaction between middle class and poor actors in which differences are made explicit and can lead to new negotiations of identity, privilege, political responsibility, and alliance," end of quote. In my case, in our case, perhaps these encounters between the families and landlords do not only foster governance processes that reinscribe differences and impoverishment. Perhaps these zones of encounter also hold the potential to challenge dominant understandings of the links between poverty and housing. I think that future studies should explore more deeply whether and how the space of encounter between poor families and the landlords may also operate as contact zones. Going forward at the policy level, the findings underscore the need to create housing policies that help low-income families maintain stable housing that is not only affordable, but also of good quality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. We are now ready to move into the Q&A portion of today's seminar. So feel free to go ahead and post a question in the chat. we can, I think we'll use the chat as a way to kind of queue up people's questions, and then I might ask you to unmute and maybe ask Guy directly. Oop, I got a private message. You can do that or post them into the public chat. But Professor Page, I understand you have a question.
I do. Thank you. Thanks, Guy, for this presentation. It's made me think about a lot of different things. I think which are in a large range, actually. But I guess the first question I had, since I'm so, my own research is quantitative, large data sets, very different style of research. How, when you're doing a set of interviews like this, I assume you started before the pandemic. Like, how did you accommodate that into your both your process and your findings? Do you think that any of the outcomes that you are ending up, or what's the right word I'm looking for? Not outcomes, but any of your findings, do you think the pandemic exacerbated them or made them less important? Or like, how do you interpret your work in the context of this, and how did you alter what you were doing in the face of that? I'm sorry, I'm going off. I just found out I have low battery, so I'm going to go off for a minute, but I'll be listening. Or I'm putting my video off for a minute, but I'm listening. I just have to climb around to get a electric.
Yeah, okay. So Jacob, do you want me to answer that, or yeah. So yeah, thanks, Marianne. The COVID definitely made things worse for the families in the study. Actually, most of the interviews, most of them, were conducted after the pandemic started. And we also included a couple of questions in the interview guide about how did the pandemic affected the problems you experience, in the arena of housing. As I said, we've collected a lot of evidence, and we just, a few weeks ago just started analyzing it. So I still, don't have, but from what we're reading, the pandemic definitely made things worse for these families. Many of them lost their jobs. Some of the negotiations that I mentioned in the findings happened during the pandemic because they were so stretched out financially. So the pandemic, that's what they told us, at least in the interviews, definitely made things worse for them in terms of housing. Yeah, and when we're still working on analyzing the data, but we're definitely going to address that when we report on the findings in articles or other written materials.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the pandemic made things worse for them. They certainly did here as well. I think, like, one example of what I'm thinking about is in the US, at least, the pandemic affected a lot of people, and maybe there was a little less shame in being desperate, because so many people were desperate, and it was so, the rhetoric about whether it's your fault or not that you're in a desperate situation was maybe muted a little bit, because there was this, sort of terrible shock to everyone. And there was a lot of many state governments and the federal government were making, were working hard to think about the issue of housing and the fact that people weren't going to be able to pay their rents. And so I could imagine a case in which during the pandemic, it's much easier, maybe not much, but it is easier for someone who can't make their rent to approach the landlord
Yeah.
than someone who's in the same situation during a different period, because there's sort of less shame in doing so, or there's sort of less of a hurdle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah. I gave the example of Yafit. Of course, all names, I change all the names, to protect their confidentiality. But I gave the example of Yafit, who she on several occasions negotiated a rent reduction from the landlord. One of these occasions was during the pandemic, but she also successfully able to get a rent reduction before. That's what she told us, before the pandemic started. So she definitely used, I think, the pandemic to get a rent reduction. I don't know. It's interesting to see. I need to go back to the interviews to see whether they feel. It's interesting what you said about feeling less shame. Um, I haven't thought about that. I should go. I need to go back to the interviews, to the transcripts, and see really, whether that's what the participants feel when we ask them about the pandemic. It's possible that, yeah, it's possible that they feel less shame, but many of them, as I said, told us that really their situation got so much worse. They fire them, people, they were fired from their jobs, and um, also their expenses grew. Some of them told us, because the children were,
Sure.
right, so you have to buy more food, and your expense, and that really made things difficult for them. The fact that their children were with them all the time, and their expenses had grown. So yeah.
Yeah. You can also see how if your kids are with you all day, it might also affect the trade-off between cheaper house and quality.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I thought it was just interesting to think about a little bit about that, which is affecting many social scientists right now, who put studies in place before this unanticipated shock occurred. But I think you have another question, so I'll stop bugging you.
Yeah, Joe also has a question about the sort of renter landlord relationship. Do you want to just unmute yourself, Joe, and ask?
Can you?
It says you're unmuted, but we can't.
Can you
Oh.
hear me now?
Oh, perhaps not. Well, why don't I'll read the question
It's
out.
really curious about, oh, okay, I think it's working. I just,
Yes, it's working now.
okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was really curious about this relationship between the landlords and the tenants that you document, and I'm curious because I think it's not something that is very much studied, and at least in economics, I'm not aware of any study that focuses on that specifically in the private market, and I only know about a couple of studies in sociology. And I was wondering if you were able to discuss other aspects of this relationship between landlords and study participants. And as I mentioned in the chat, I'm thinking that beyond rent negotiations, there could be other decisions made by the landlord that can impact housing insecurity.
Yeah. This is great. Thanks. This is a real issue that came from the study, the relationships between the participants and the landlord. When I started the study, I thought, I approached this study with a critical, perspective, and I thought that I'm going to discover that the landlords are exploiting these families and manipulating them and doing all these terrible things. And I did find that on in some respects, but surprisingly, I also found that these relationships were more were more complex than I, thought that I would find. Um, Not only did they give them, I didn't have time to talk about it in the talk. I didn't want, to present too many findings and to overwhelm you guys, but there are definitely other aspects that show that the relationships between the landlords and the families are, are, how should I say, are in some ways positive, not only in terms of rent reduction, but some families stay in touch with the landlord after they left the apartment, they rented, and they're talking with them on occasions, asking them, how are you doing, and how are you doing, and how are things for you, and all of that. Many of them said that the landlord is really responsive to all kinds of, as you said, renovations and stuff like that. Um, so there were many aspects of this relationship between the families and the landlords that I found them surprising, because they were really in really good relationships. They tell they it's complicated. They did tell us about, the fact that they only care about the money, and they didn't invest in the apartment because they were cheap and all of that. But again, there was also the other side of the coin, where the relationships were really um, um, in some ways even beneficial to the families, not only in terms of rent reduction and rent negotiations, but just in terms of, you know, a human being to a human being. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but I was really surprised by that, because I thought, it's going to be terrible. They hate the landlords and all of that, but it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating, because I mean there is a lot of work from anthropologists on how pure market transactions can dehumanize some of the relationship. And you mentioned that in the US we don't always deal with individuals; we often deals with property managers,
Maybe
and
that's the
maybe that
difference.
influences the type of relationship as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, families did talk about relationships that were, you know, very exploitive and all of that. But I was really, really surprised to discover that many of them also talked about the other side of this relationship. Um, yeah, many of them had a lot of good things to say about their landlord. I was really surprised to discover that. I think that the explanation that you suggested, I think maybe that's the reason. Maybe the fact that in Israel, a rental housing is owned by families, by individuals, and not by, as you said, corporations and property managers and all of that.
Thank you.
So if I may ask a question, I one of the things I found interesting, among many in your talk, was this the strategy of using overdrafting on a bank account as a way to make rent.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's something that's particular to the Israeli context that makes that a viable strategy that is less, or maybe it is used more widely other places. One of the nice things about having Zoom talks, like I was doing all this research on my own during your talk. In the U.S., apparently, Americans pay $17 billion in overdraft fees every year, and there's a category of people who are frequent overdrafters that pay $500 or more on average a year. But there are mechanisms like payday loans and other sort of like fairly predatory lending mechanisms in the US. I wonder if are less available or less widely used in Israel.
Yeah, the payday loans, we have payday loans. They are less common in Israel, just because, you can just overdraw your bank account. Really, you don't. It's. I think it's easier. I don't remember exactly the whole banking system in the U.S. and how it works in terms of overdraft and credit card and all of that. But in Israel, it's just, you can just do it. You can just go to the ATM and withdraw more money than you have in your checking account, and people do it, especially low income people. And low income people in Israel often live, with an overdraft. It's much easier. I think it's much easier to do that here in Israel than the US. The banks, of course, charge them, fees, right? That's for sure. I'm not sure what's the exact amount of, the total fees, pay overdraft fees, but um, I don't know. I think that it's more common. I remember when I was in the U.S. As I said, I lived there for 5 years. It was really. I don't think I was able to. The bank didn't allow me to overdraw my account. I don't think I ever, and I was a poor graduate student. I needed, yeah, right, to overdraw my account. But I, I think it's more difficult in the US maybe I don't know, maybe to overdraw your account. In Israel, it's just simple. Again, you go to the ATM, you go to the bank, and they give you, and the banks also can give you loans. You have an overdraft. I didn't talk about it, but some families told me they had an overdraft and they went to the bank and the bank gave them a loan to cover the overdraft that they have for the bank to pay, right? So um I don't know. I hope that maybe that's helped. But I think that the overdrafting the account is very common among low income families in Israel. Um, that's for sure.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see new questions in the chat. Does anyone have anything on your mind? Any last sort of burning questions for Guy?
I have one, which is again, sort of coming from the world of the economist. I find that these different coping mechanisms really believable, but I'm not sure what to do with that information in terms of effective policy to reduce the stresses of housing insecurity. And I wondered if you try to interpret your results through that lens, what you might offer in terms of like good policy solutions.
Yeah. I think it's it's pretty straightforward. I think the major issue is that the families emphasized in the interviews is rent costs. The rent costs. I think maybe that's the first thing that we need to do in terms of housing policy in Israel. Why do they make compromises on housing quality and attributes? Why do they negotiate rent reductions with their landlord? Why do they overdraft the account? Because rents are so high and they earn, minimum wage is ridiculous in Israel. So there's this gap between what they earn and rent costs. And so I think the first thing that we need to do in terms of housing policy is just, um, do something about rent costs and also offer families, maybe municipalities or the government can build long-term rental housing projects. For example, in Tel Aviv, the city where I live, the municipality is building as we speak a couple of housing projects, not for low income families, for middle class families, housing projects that the city of Tel Aviv is going a long-term rental project, going to rent them for middle-class families on a very below the market rent price, and the city promises the families who rent that, you know, it's yours for 5-10 years. I think that's, you know, solutions that maybe can help these families. And also, yeah, just something must be done about you know, the economist, you guys can tell me what can we do to reduce the soaring rental costs in Israel and the US. What, you know, what can the government do in the US or in Israel? It's but maybe just build more long-term rental housing projects for low-income families also, not just for middle-class families.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Joe's suggestion in the chat is
Maybe
definitely on the minds of people in California.
Yes.
single residential. Yeah, the fact that you can only build one. Yeah. In Israel, we have the opposite problem. Everywhere you go, you see tall buildings, 20, 30 floors. It has become ridiculous, you know, places that had nothing, that was desert, and then you see all these high rise. And yeah, Israel is building really, really high buildings because there's such a significant housing crisis.
Any more questions?
I think not.
Well, thank you so much, Guy. This was a real treat.
Thank you, guys. It was really great. I really enjoyed spending my evening with you.
We'll let you go to bed now.
Okay.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Guy. Take care.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thank you, guys.